August 8th, 1944, 11:30 p.m., Falaise, Normandy. The sound is the deep guttural roar of a Maybach engine pushing a 45-ton steel beast through the darkness to the German soldiers dug into positions south of Caen. This sound has become the harbinger of death. They know what it means. Tanks, Allied tanks, coming through the night. But this is not the sound of British Shermans or American Grants. This is something different, something heavier, something that sends experienced German tank crews scrambling for their Panzerfausts and praying their 88mm guns are properly sighted. Oberst Hans von Luck, commander of the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, stands in his command half-track south of Caen, listening to the reports crackling over the radio. His division, the 21st Panzer, has been fighting the British and Canadians for 2 months. They know the enemy's equipment. They know the capabilities of the Sherman Firefly, the British tank destroyer that can kill a Tiger from the front. They know the Churchill infantry tank, slow but heavily armored. They know what they are facing, except tonight they are hearing something new. Herr Oberst, his radio operator says urgently, forward positions report heavy tanks, not Churchills, something else bigger. They are breaking through at Syntho. Von Luck feels his stomach tighten. Heavy tanks. The Allies do not have heavy tanks in quantity. The British have a few experimental models, but nothing that should be operating at night in mass formations. Yet the reports are consistent. Heavy tanks, moving fast, crushing defensive positions, and they are Canadian. Von Luck has fought the Canadians since D-Day. He respects them. They are aggressive, well-trained, and they do not quit. But the Canadian armored formations he has faced until now used Shermans, like everyone else. Good tanks when used properly, but vulnerable to German anti-tank guns and Panzers. These reports describe something different. Tanks that are shrugging off anti-tank fire. Tanks that are overrunning German positions before defenders can effectively engage them. Tanks that are, according to one panicked transmission, as big as Tigers but moving like Shermans. Von Luck, a professional soldier who has fought in Poland, France, Russia, and now Normandy, understands immediately what this means. The Canadians have introduced a new weapon, and by the sound of the reports flooding in, it is changing the tactical equation. This is not the story of a tank that was the best armored or the best gunned or the fastest. This is the story of a tank that German generals feared more than any other Allied tank, not because of a single overwhelming advantage, but because of a combination of factors that made it uniquely dangerous in the specific conditions of the Normandy campaign. This is the story of the Ram tank, but more specifically, this is the story of the Ram Kangaroo, an armored personnel carrier converted from Canadian-built Ram tanks that German intelligence initially mistook for a new type of heavy tank. And it is the story of how a vehicle that was never intended to fight as a tank became, in the minds of German commanders, more threatening than the best British armor because of what it represented: mobility, protection, and the ability to deliver infantry directly into German positions in numbers that could not be stopped. Because Hitler's generals did not fear the Ram Kangaroo itself. They feared what it did. It changed the fundamental tactical problem of armored warfare. For the first time, infantry could keep up with tanks, protected from fire, and arrive at the objective with enough strength to hold what the tanks had taken. This was revolutionary. And for German commanders trying to defend against overwhelming Allied material superiority, it was a nightmare. This is the story of why a converted tank that never fired a shot was more feared by Hitler's generals than the powerful British Firefly or Churchill. Because fear in war is not just about what can kill you. It is about what can defeat your strategy. And the Ram Kangaroo did exactly that. To understand why German generals feared the Ram Kangaroo, you must first understand the fundamental problem of armored warfare in Normandy. By August 1944, 2 months into the campaign, both sides understood the tactical realities. Tanks were powerful but vulnerable. A Sherman tank could dominate infantry in open country, but against prepared defenses with anti-tank guns, against German panzers in hull-down positions, against infantry with Panzerfausts in bocage country, tanks were vulnerable. They needed infantry support. Infantry could clear anti-tank positions. Infantry could suppress enemy infantry. Infantry could occupy ground that tanks could not hold alone. This was doctrine on both sides. But there was a problem. Infantry could not keep up with tanks. When Allied armor advanced, infantry followed on foot or in trucks. The tanks would break through German positions, but then they would have to wait, sometimes for hours, for the infantry to catch up. And during that wait, they were vulnerable to counterattack. German doctrine exploited this gap. Let the Allied tanks break through. Then, counterattack before the infantry arrives, destroy the isolated tanks, retake the position. This tactic worked repeatedly in Normandy. Allied armor would penetrate German lines. German reserves would counterattack. The Allied tanks, unsupported by infantry, would be forced to withdraw or be destroyed. The solution seemed obvious: put the infantry in vehicles that could keep up with the tanks. But what vehicles? Trucks were vulnerable to artillery and machine gun fire. The infantry would arrive at the objective suppressed, disorganized, and depleted. Half-tracks were better, but still thin-skinned. A single machine gun burst could kill everyone inside. What the Allies needed was armored transport that could move at tank speed, survive the battlefield long enough to deliver infantry to the objective, and be available in sufficient numbers to make a difference. The British had experimented with converting tanks into armored personnel carriers. They removed the turret from obsolete tanks and used the hull to carry infantry. But these conversions were limited in number and not widely adopted. The Americans used half-tracks, which were adequate but not ideal. And the Canadians, as of mid-1944, were using the same mix of vehicles as everyone else. Their infantry advanced on foot or in vulnerable trucks until August 1944. Until Operation Totalize. Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, commanding the 2nd Canadian Corps, faced a difficult problem. He had been ordered to break through German defensive lines south of Caen and advance toward Falaise. The German defenses were formidable: multiple lines of anti-tank guns, hull-down Panzers, infantry in prepared positions, and the terrain was open, providing excellent fields of fire for defenders. Previous Allied attacks in this sector had failed with heavy casualties. Simonds needed a new approach. He could not simply send tanks and infantry forward in daylight. They would be destroyed before reaching German positions. He needed to concentrate force, achieve surprise, and deliver infantry to the objective with enough strength to hold it. Simonds was an innovative thinker, one of the best operational commanders the Allies produced, and he developed a plan that was audacious, complex, and dependent on a vehicle that did not officially exist yet. He would attack at night. He would use massive bombing to suppress German positions. He would navigate using radio beacons rather than visual landmarks. And critically, he would transport infantry in armored vehicles that could keep pace with tanks and survive German fire long enough to deliver troops to their objectives. But where would he get these armored vehicles? The answer lay in Canadian tank production. Canada had developed and produced its own tank during the war, the Ram. The Ram was based on the American M3 medium tank chassis, but with a Canadian-designed hull and turret. It mounted a 6-pounder gun, later upgraded to a 75mm gun in the Ram Mark II. The Ram was a competent design, well-armored for a medium tank, reliable mechanically, good mobility. But by 1944, it was obsolete before it ever saw combat as a gun tank. The American Sherman tank, which used a similar chassis, was available in vast quantities through Lend-Lease. The Sherman had better gun options, better ammunition supply, and the advantage of standardization across Allied forces. Canadian armored units were equipped with Shermans. The Rams, of which Canada had produced over 2,000, were relegated to training roles. Hundreds of them sat in depots in Britain, perfectly good tanks with no combat role. Simonds saw an opportunity. What if the Rams were converted into armored personnel carriers, remove the turret, seal the turret ring, use the interior space to carry infantry? A Ram hull could carry 10 to 12 infantrymen in addition to the driver and co-driver. It had the same mobility as a Sherman tank, and it had armor thick enough to resist machine gun fire and shell fragments. It was not perfect. The infantry would be cramped. They would have to climb out over the hull, exposing themselves briefly. But it was infinitely better than advancing in trucks or on foot. Simonds proposed this conversion to his superiors. The British and Canadian High Command approved, and in a remarkable feat of military logistics, workshops in Britain began converting Rams into what would be called kangaroos, named after the iconic Australian animal, in a nod to Commonwealth cooperation. The conversion was simple. Remove the turret and main gun, weld armor plate over the turret ring. Cut entry hatches in the hull sides, or leave the top open for infantry to climb in and out. Install benches, or leave the interior empty for troops to stand. 76 Kangaroos were ready for Operation Totalize, which was scheduled for August 8, 1944. The German intelligence services, which had been tracking Allied preparations through reconnaissance and signals intelligence, knew a major offensive was coming. But they did not know about the Kangaroos. They had no intelligence on armored personnel carriers being concentrated in the Canadian sector. And when the attack began on the night of August 7th into August 8th, they were completely unprepared for what they encountered. Operation Totalize began at 11:30 p.m. on August 7th with a massive aerial bombardment. 1,000 British and Canadian heavy bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives on German positions. Then, through the smoke and dust, the ground assault began. Canadian and Polish armored divisions advanced in columns, guided by radio beacons and following tracer fire from Bofors guns, marking the axis of advance. And with them, in the darkness, came the Kangaroos. German forward positions, stunned by the bombing, heard the engines. Lots of engines, heavy engines. They assumed a major tank assault was coming. They prepared to engage armor. Then, the Kangaroos emerged from the darkness and smoke. To German defenders, in the confusion of a night battle, the Kangaroos looked like tanks. They were the same size as Shermans or Rams. They had the same mobility. They moved in formation with the actual tanks. German anti-tank guns engaged them. Shots hit. Some Kangaroos were damaged or destroyed, but many got through. And then, at the objective, infantry poured out. Not infantry that had been marching for hours, exhausted and depleted by artillery. Not infantry that had been riding in trucks, suppressed and disorganized. But fresh infantry, organized, with weapons ready, exiting armored vehicles directly into German positions. The psychological and tactical impact was immediate. German defenders found themselves facing close-range infantry assault before they could reorganize after the tank attack. Positions that might have held against tanks alone were overrun by the combination of armor and immediately following infantry. Oberst von Luck, monitoring the battle from his headquarters, received increasingly desperate reports. Massive tank attack. New heavy vehicles, unknown type. Infantry arriving in armored vehicles. Positions being overrun. He tried to get clarification. What exactly were these new vehicles? The reports were confused. Some observers thought they were American Priest self-propelled guns being used as troop carriers. Others thought they were a new type of British heavy tank. Still others reported that they looked like ram tanks but without turrets. Von Luck forwarded these reports to division headquarters, which forwarded them to Corps, which forwarded them to the 7th Army Command. And at each level, the confusion grew. Because no one in German intelligence had predicted this, they had expected the standard Allied assault, tanks and infantry, coordinated but separate. They had not expected armored infantry that could move with tanks and fight immediately upon arrival. The German response was improvised and inadequate. Anti-tank guns engaged the Kangaroos, but many crews wasted shots on vehicles that were not the primary threat. The actual gun tanks, the Shermans and Churchills, were sometimes given less attention because German crews were focused on the larger number of tanks they could see. German artillery fired on Canadian positions, but the infantry that had arrived in Kangaroos was already dug in or assaulting German strongpoints, not strung out in vulnerable columns as expected. And German counterattacks, the standard response to Allied breakthroughs, were less effective, because Canadian infantry was in position to support the tanks rather than still moving up from the rear. By the afternoon of August 8th, German commanders were beginning to understand what they were facing. Intelligence officers interrogated captured Canadian soldiers and examined knocked-out Kangaroos. They realized these were not new tanks, but converted Rams being used as armored personnel carriers. But understanding what the Kangaroos were did not make them less threatening. In fact, it made them more threatening. Because German commanders realized this was not a one-time improvisation. This was a new tactical system. And if the Allies could produce armored personnel carriers in quantity, it would fundamentally change the battlefield equation. General Major Kurt Meyer, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division, sent a report to his corps commander on August 9th analyzing the Canadian attack. Meyer was a combat veteran who had fought in Poland, France, the Balkans, and Russia. Before Normandy. He was not easily impressed or frightened, but his report on the Kangaroos was blunt. The enemy has introduced armored troop carriers in large numbers. These vehicles allow infantry to accompany armor directly to the objective. This eliminates the gap we have exploited in previous battles. Tank attacks supported by armored infantry are extremely difficult to stop with our current defensive tactics. Recommend immediate countermeasures. Meyer's report went up the chain to General Heinrich Eberbach, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, who forwarded it with his own assessment to Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, Commander-in-Chief West. Von Kluge, reading the reports from Normandy, understood the implications. The Allies had solved a fundamental problem of armored warfare. And they had done it with a simple, inelegant solution, converting obsolete tanks into battle taxis. It was not sophisticated, but it worked. And in war, what works is what matters. Von Klug's response, documented in German military records captured after the war, included a passage that reveals the depth of German concern. The appearance of enemy armored personnel carriers in the Canadian sector represents a significant tactical development. These vehicles, while not heavily armed, increase the combat effectiveness of enemy armored formations by ensuring infantry support is immediately available. All commands should consider this development in defensive planning. Anti-tank priorities should focus on actual gun tanks rather than on what appear to be armored personnel carriers, as the latter are not the primary threat but enablers of the primary threat. This directive shows that German commanders understood the Kangaroo's role, but it also shows they were uncertain how to counter it. If you focused anti-tank fire on the real tanks, the Kangaroos delivered infantry that overran your positions. If you focused on destroying Kangaroos, the real tanks killed your anti-tank guns. It was a tactical dilemma with no easy solution, and it got worse. Because the success of the Kangaroos in Operation Totalize led to rapid expansion of the concept. The British began converting their own obsolete tanks into armored personnel carriers. The Canadians produced more Kangaroos, and by September 1944, armored personnel carriers were becoming standard equipment in Canadian and British armored divisions. The Germans, monitoring this development through intelligence reports and battlefield observation, watched with growing concern as the tactical innovation they had first encountered in August spread throughout Allied forces. To understand why German generals feared the Kangaroo more than tanks like the British Sherman Firefly, you must understand what each represented strategically. The Sherman Firefly was a dangerous weapon. It mounted a 17-pounder gun, one of the most powerful anti-tank guns of the war, on a Sherman chassis. It could penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger tank at combat ranges. German tank crews learned to fear the Firefly and to prioritize it as a target. But the Firefly was fundamentally a defensive weapon. It could kill German tanks, but it could not, by itself, break through German defensive positions. It could not hold ground. It was a tank destroyer that happened to look like a regular Sherman, which gave it tactical surprise but did not change the operational problem. The Churchill infantry tank was formidable in a different way. Heavily armored, especially on the frontal arc, capable of absorbing punishment that would destroy a Sherman, equipped with a hull-mounted howitzer in some variants for close support. But the Churchill was slow. It could not exploit breakthroughs. It could support infantry assaults, but could not conduct the kind of rapid mobile operations that characterized armored warfare. German commanders respected the Firefly and the Churchill, but they did not fear them in the same way. They feared the Kangaroo, because the Kangaroo changed what Allied armored forces could do. Before the Kangaroo, Allied armor could break through German lines, but often could not hold the breach long enough to exploit it. German counterattacks would hit the tanks before infantry arrived in strength. After the Kangaroo, Canadian and British armor could break through and immediately establish infantry in defensive positions that could resist counterattacks. This changed the operational tempo. It made Allied attacks faster, more effective, and harder to reverse. And German generals, already facing overwhelming Allied material superiority, now faced an enemy that had solved one of the key tactical problems that had previously given German forces opportunities to counterattack successfully. Field Marshal Walter Model, who took command of German forces in the West in August 1944, was briefed on the Kangaroo threat shortly after assuming command. Model was a defensive specialist, known for his ability to stabilize crumbling fronts. He had stopped Soviet offensives in Russia through tactical skill and ruthless commitment of reserves. But reading the reports from Normandy, Model understood that the tactical situation in the West was different from the East. In Russia, German forces could trade space for time. They could conduct mobile defense, falling back to successive defensive lines. The Soviets, advancing on foot with limited mechanized transport, could be hit by counterattacks before their infantry consolidated gains made by their armor. But in Normandy, facing the Canadians and British with their armored personnel carriers, this approach was less effective. Allied infantry arrived with the armor. There was no gap to exploit. Model issued a directive to his corps and division commanders in late August that specifically addressed the Kangaroo threat. Enemy use of armored personnel carriers has significantly increased the effectiveness of Allied armored operations. These vehicles must be engaged by all available weapons, including artillery and infantry anti-tank weapons, before they can deliver their infantry. However, priority must still be given to destroying enemy gun tanks. Commanders must exercise judgment in allocating fire. The goal is to separate enemy armor from its infantry support by destroying the transport vehicles. This directive reveals the dilemma German commanders faced. They knew they needed to stop the Kangaroos, but they also knew that the gun tanks were the primary threat. Dividing fire between multiple target types reduced effectiveness against both. It was a command problem with no good solution, and the Germans never really solved it. Throughout the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces advanced through France and into the Low Countries, Canadian formations equipped with Kangaroos continued to demonstrate the effectiveness of armored infantry. The Battle of the Scheldt Estuary in October and November 1944 saw extensive use of Kangaroos in difficult terrain. German commanders defending the Scheldt specifically noted in reports that Canadian attacks were particularly difficult to stop because enemy infantry arrives immediately behind armor in protected vehicles, allowing for rapid consolidation of gains. The fighting around Walcheren Island, where Canadian forces assaulted German positions in flooded terrain, demonstrated another advantage of the Kangaroo. In conditions where trucks would bog down and infantry on foot would struggle through mud and water, the tracked Kangaroos could maintain mobility and deliver troops to their objectives. German prisoners captured during the Scheldt battles, when interrogated by Canadian intelligence, frequently mentioned the Kangaroos. One captured German lieutenant from the 64th Infantry Division, when asked what weapons he most feared, listed the Kangaroo before mentioning Allied tanks or artillery. When the interrogator expressed surprise, the lieutenant explained, "The armored carriers mean we cannot delay the enemy infantry. They arrive too quickly. We cannot counterattack before they are dug in. This makes every position vulnerable." This testimony, preserved in Canadian military archives, shows that the psychological impact of the Kangaroo extended beyond senior commanders. Junior officers and common soldiers also understood that the tactical situation had changed. By December 1944, German intelligence had produced detailed reports on Allied armored personnel carriers. These reports, captured after the war, show that the Germans had accurately assessed the Kangaroo's capabilities and limitations. They knew it was converted from ram tanks. They knew it carried 10 to 12 infantry. They knew it had no offensive armament beyond the small arms of the infantry inside. They knew it was vulnerable to direct fire from anti-tank guns, but knowing these facts did not give them a solution to the tactical problem. Because the Kangaroo's value was not in its armor or armament, it was in what it allowed Allied forces to do. It increased operational tempo. It reduced the time between armor breakthrough and infantry consolidation. It allowed Allied forces to sustain offensive operations over longer periods because infantry casualties from indirect fire during movement were reduced, and it gave Allied commanders flexibility that German commanders could not match. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer Troops and one of the architects of German armored doctrine, reviewed reports on Allied armored personnel carriers in late 1944. Guderian, who had pioneered combined arms warfare with tanks and motorized infantry working closely together, understood immediately what the Allies had achieved. In a report to Hitler in January 1945, Guderian wrote, "The enemy use of armored infantry transport has restored tactical mobility to infantry in armored operations. This is what we achieved in France in 1940, with our Panzergrenadier formations riding in half tracks. The enemy has now adopted similar methods, but with better protected vehicles. Our current defensive tactics are predicated on exploiting the gap between enemy armor and infantry. When this gap is eliminated, our defensive effectiveness declines significantly." Guderian recommended that Germany develop its own armored personnel carriers. But by January 1945, Germany lacked the industrial capacity and raw materials to produce such vehicles in meaningful numbers. The war was lost. German industry could barely produce enough tanks and assault guns to replace losses. Creating an entirely new class of vehicle was impossible. So German forces faced the final months of the war with no effective counter to Allied armored infantry. This asymmetry contributed to the speed of Allied advances in the final campaigns, when American, British, and Canadian forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945 and advanced into Germany. The combination of armor and armored infantry proved decisive. German defenses that might have delayed attacks for days or weeks collapsed in hours because Allied infantry could move with armor, exploit breakthroughs immediately, and hold gains against counterattacks. The Kangaroo's contribution to these victories was significant, but often overlooked in post-war histories. Because armored personnel carriers are not dramatic, they do not have the visual appeal of tanks with large guns, they do not rack up kill counts, they simply do their job, moving infantry from point A to point B while keeping them alive. But to German generals trying to defend against Allied offensives, the Kangaroo was a more persistent problem than any individual tank type. Because you could plan defenses against tanks, you could position anti-tank guns, dig in Panzers, create kill zones. But when the tanks arrived with infantry already there, when every breakthrough immediately became a lodgment, when counterattacks hit prepared positions instead of isolated armor, all those defensive plans became much less effective. This is why German generals feared the Kangaroo, not because it could destroy their tanks, but because it could render their defensive strategies ineffective. Fear in military operations is not always about the weapon that kills you. Sometimes it is about the weapon that makes it impossible to win. And for German generals in 1944 and 1945, facing overwhelming Allied material superiority, the Kangaroo was exactly that kind of weapon. It took away one of the few tactical advantages they still had, the gap between enemy armor and infantry, and left them with no good options. The Canadians built the Ram tank as a gun tank, but they gave German generals nightmares by converting it into something that could not fight at all. That is innovation. That is understanding warfare not as a contest of individual weapons, but as a system of interconnected capabilities. And that is why the Ram Kangaroo, a humble converted tank that never fired its main gun in anger, was more feared by Hitler's generals than Britain's most powerful tanks. Because power is not just about what you can destroy. Sometimes it is about what you enable others to do. And the Kangaroo enabled Allied infantry to do what they had never done before. Fight at the speed of armor, that changed everything.